What's going on, people in YouTube land? Kimchi Chris here, and welcome to today's brand new video where we are taking a look at a list. That's right, a list from ultimateclassicrock.com. You know that website, the one that's releasing lists all the time and news bits and things like that. You know, clickbait. They like getting people arguing, and that's what these lists are basically for. And today's list we are going to take a look at is the top 20 list of American classic rock bands of the 80s. That's right, a decade defined by hairspray, big hooks, awesome movies, and all kinds of great culture. And as a result, I'm sure this list will have a lot of the bands we would expect to be featured on this list. I'm sure we'll see Motley Crue, I'm sure we'll see Bon Jovi, I'm sure we'll see Van Halen, all kinds of stuff. But it also makes me wonder what all will be included, because the term classic rock band is a pretty broad term, and obviously, again, the 80s were very much known for hair metal, but will we see some early metal in there, perhaps some Metallica or Slayer? Probably not, but maybe we will. Will we kind of venture into more of a pop category and have something, you know, like Prince in there because it's the 80s and Prince was king? So let's just dive in and find out. Now, before we really jump into this, I did read some of the rules here, and there are a few rules important to keep in mind. This is the top 20 American classic rock bands of the 80s, right? So we can't have Def Leppard, we can't have Iron Maiden, we can't have Judas Priest, things like that. You know, they're not there because they're not from America. And another thing that's important that kind of just throws Prince out the door, like I just mentioned he might be in there, is that they are not including solo artists on here. It mentions Bruce Springsteen, for example, Stevie Nicks, Billy Joel, things like that. So, you know, there's some rules and regulations, because apparently you had to be in a band to be one of the best of the 80s, and you had to be from America. So without further ado, let's jump into this list and find out who the top 20 classic rock bands are of the 80s according to ultimateclassicrock.com. So starting in at number 20, we have Heart. That's not really who I would have thought we would have started the list with, because I always kind of consider them more of a 70s band, but of course they did have a commercial comeback and almost zenith in the 80s, so you know, decent band to start out with. I like Heart. I do like their 70s stuff a whole lot more. Their 80s stuff is a little too ballady for me, a little too weak, a little too I don't know, adult contemporary for the 80s. I don't really know the best way to describe it, but their 80s stuff is not my favorite. The one time I got to see Heart live, actually, was funny because it would be a really exciting rock show, and then they played one of the ballads from the 80s, and the energy kind of went down, even for the people that enjoy those songs, because they're just not as exciting as Barracuda or something like that. But, you know, starting the list with Heart, they're a strong contender, definitely a strong band. I like Heart, so it's a good way to start. Number 19, Red Hot Chili Peppers. Moving on, the Go-Go's at number 18. Now that's an interesting inclusion just because I don't consider the Go-Go's a rock band per se, a classic rock band. They're more of a classic pop band in that regard, and I would definitely say they belong on that list, but a classic rock list, I don't know. When I think classic rock, or at least the terminology of classic rock, I think of classic rock radio. You know the radio station, you have one in your town, the one that plays Bad Company 100 times in an hour, you know the place. So they don't usually play the Go-Go's, but they're in here. I think they're a good band, they're talented, and definitely helped break some barriers down, along with the likes of Joan Jett, Heart, bands like that. So, you know, having them in there is okay. I just didn't really expect them. It kind of throws off what I thought this list would be too, kind of early on, which I think is kind of cool actually, because classic rock can be kind of a boring thing to talk about, especially when you talk about it all the time on YouTube. Nonetheless, kind of interesting to have the Go-Go's in there, so that's cool. Number 17, hey! We talk about Kiss all the time on the channel. I honestly didn't predict that Kiss would be on this list, but they are on this list at 17. And obviously you can't ignore Lick It Up, Heaven's on Fire, Tears Are Falling Forever, even though that was kind of, you know, towards the end there. But nonetheless, they definitely had a resurgence in the 80s. I just am a little surprised to see them on this list, because the general populace kind of ignores 80s Kiss and, you know, just doesn't really seem to care about them. But on here it highlights Creatures of the Night even, which is pretty cool. And again, yeah, it talks about Lick It Up, Heaven's on Fire, Tears Are Falling Forever. Literally the songs I just brought up are the ones that are listed here as their comeback songs. So having Kiss on the list is pretty cool. So I think they definitely belong on there. Of course, I would place them a little bit higher, but you know, in the general scheme of the 80s, I get why they're a little bit lower on there. I'm not hating, obviously, on 80s Kiss. I love 80s Kiss, but I get it. Number 16, Huey, Lewis, and the News. Okay, that's another band I consider a pop act. I'm a little surprised they're on there. So obviously this is going to kind of go in a direction of just 80s music, not necessarily 80s rock and roll. So, you know, at this point I'll really be surprised to see something like Slayer on there. But Huey Lewis and the News, it's whatever. I know they're technically a band, but they said they weren't going to include Bruce Springsteen, which is kind of, you know, Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band. So that's kind of a little bit weird that they're on there. Hey, though, maybe we'll see Prince and the Revolution on here in just a little bit. Maybe we'll see that now, because my whole mind is kind of being changed, because in any world of a list that includes Huey Lewis and the News, you gotta include Prince, because Prince and the Revolution, they're just, I'm sorry, they're better. They're just better. So nonetheless, Huey Lewis and the News are number 16. Number 15, Devo. That's interesting too. I like Devo, but that's another band I personally wouldn't include on a kind of classic rock type of list, because they're more of a new wave band, kind of post-punk, you know, not exactly pop, but definitely electronica. It kind of makes you wonder, again, what else you're going to see on this list. This list isn't going completely paint by numbers. I'm kind of thinking at this point we're not going to see as much hair metal, because outside of Kiss, you haven't really seen much hair metal in general, but having Devo on there is definitely cool. Of course, it highlights freedom of choice and Whip It as the songs on there, and a lot of people kind of consider them somewhat of a one-hit wonder because of Whip It, but there's more to Devo than that. They're a very interesting band, had a cool visual aspect, of course, and a cool sound all to their own, and of course you can't deny the Weird Al parody, style parody at least, of Dare to Be Stupid being iconic, so that alone kind of bumps them up the list for me. So at number 14 we have the Pretenders. Now, I'm not super familiar with this band, but I know that they deserve to be there, if nothing else just for Chrissie Hynde being an amazing rock and roll frontwoman, but I don't know enough to really comment on them outside of saying, yeah, they represent the 80s pretty well and they do belong here. If you have some Pretenders albums or songs or something like that you'd like to recommend me, maybe leave it below, but I need to look into the Pretenders because I know everybody loves them. I'm just not super familiar with them. But at number 13, I'm definitely familiar with this band. That is Blondie. I love Blondie. Again, I kind of like their 70s stuff a little bit more. They kind of continue to go more and more and more into a pop direction, but, you know, as it says on here, you know, Call Me Alone, that alone kind of puts them on the list. And of course, Debbie Harry is just like the quintessential rock and roll front woman of all time. I absolutely have nothing but respect for her, nothing but respect for the band. And what's really cool about this list is that it's a classic rock list, a genre that kind of ignores females a lot, let's just be fair. But so far, we've had quite a few female-fronted bands and even one completely female band in the Go-Go's. So this is an interesting list. Definitely not what I expected. I wouldn't have predicted Blondie being on there initially because of, again, thinking maybe they're just a little too poppy for this list, but they work really well on there, and Blondie's a great representation of the late 70s as well as the early 80s. And number 12, The Cars. The Cars. That's another band similar to the Pretenders. I know they're a classic band, and I know that they're very well respected and that they deserve to be on here, but I don't know a lot about The Cars to really comment on them, so I don't know. They're at 12, and I know they're better than the Red Hot Chili Peppers and Huey Lewis, so that's good. Number 11, Bon Jovi. Huh, interesting. I'm not a big Bon Jovi fan, okay? I'm not a big Bon Jovi fan. I'm just gonna get it out there. I kind of don't like them. Sorry, hate on me if you want to. You can call it burnout from my mom loving them her whole life and kind of, you know, them just being omnipresent in my life, and I just, you know, got a little too much. That being said, I kind of expected Bon Jovi to be like in the top 3 on this list, because when you talk about the 1980s, especially American bands, because we're excluding things like Def Leppard at this point, Bon Jovi's top 3 material, okay? They are the 80s as far as classic rock goes. You can't escape Bon Jovi when you're on classic rock radio between Living on a Prayer and Runaway and Bad Medicine and all those songs. So I'm surprised they're so low, and it kind of makes me wonder what we're going to get here in just a little bit in the top 10, because Bon Jovi not being included in the top 10 on a 80s classic rock countdown list, that's just, it's a little shocking, frankly. But nonetheless, let's see what we get into as we get into the top 10. So at number 10, we have Hall & Oates. Oh, wow. Hall & Oates. Okay. I like Hall & Oates. I don't dislike Hall & Oates. But again, kind of like some of these others, they're more of a pop band in my mindset. They are more of a pop band, more of a pop rock band at best or at worst, depending how you kind of look at it. I don't really consider them a classic rock band, but I mean, they are classic and they're kind of a rockish band, and I guess they, you know, deserve to be on here. It's just kind of weird to see them on there in a way because, again, we're talking classic rock and I just don't really categorize them as that. But nonetheless, Hall & Oates, that's a fine addition. I'm okay with Hall & Oates. Fun fact, John Oates lives really close to me. Bet you didn't know that. But nonetheless, number 9, Motley Crue. Yes, they obviously deserve to be on there, but Similar to Bon Jovi, I was kind of predicting top 3 territory, or at least top 5. I know a lot of the more higher class musicians don't respect Motley Crue. They also don't respect Bon Jovi. And the fact that we've seen such a small representation of hair metal in general on this list is a little bit weird, a little bit pompous, honestly, because when you think 80s classic rock, you think hair metal, and there's been a very small representation of it on here. But nonetheless, you gotta have Motley Crue. You gotta have Motley Crue. You gotta have them, you know? You gotta have Too Fast for Love, Dr. Feelgood, On With The Show. Yeah, I went straight into a deep cut there because I love the deep cuts, you know? Shout at the Devil, Girls, 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 Wild Side, Don't Go Away, Mad, Just Go Away. I mean, the list goes on of Motley Crue classics. They had to be on this list. I'm a little surprised they're this low, so it makes me very intrigued as to what we're gonna see in just a minute here. But nonetheless, they were gonna be there. We knew it. They had to be there. Number 8, Journey. Of course you have to have Journey there. I didn't even think about Journey really when I was going through the list because I'm kind of just a casual Journey guy. I don't really care too much about them, but you have to have Journey when it's an 80s list if you're just looking at it from a purely like this is the 80s standpoint. You know, they would definitely be top 5 or top 3 as well, I would think. So at number 8, that's very interesting. But nonetheless, I mean, they have so many hits, Any Way You Want It, Don't Stop Believin', Who's Crying Now, Still They Ride, Open Arms, all kinds of songs. I was kind of reading the list there, but I do know a lot of those songs. I'm just not a huge Journey guy. The only thing I've ever owned from Journey, I had their greatest hits on vinyl, the original pressing, and for some reason that record's worth a lot. I ended up selling it. Because I kind of had it because I felt, I need a Journey record, I need something, but I ended up selling it because it was worth a fair amount. I could always get it again on CD or something, or just go stream it on Spotify. It's 2020, we can do that. So, that makes sense having them on there. Okay, number 7 is one that's a little bit peculiar to me. It's someone that definitely belongs on any music list because he's one of my favorites of all time. But notice I'm saying he. Yeah, there's a backing band there, but they again said that they weren't going to put Bruce Springsteen on there. But at number 7, we have Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. And yeah, they definitely had quite the resurgence during the 80s. Mind you, one of the biggest records from Tom Petty during that time was the Full Moon Fever record. That's a solo record technically, but nonetheless, Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers were huge in the 80s, just like they were in the 70s, just like they were in the 90s, just like they were till Tom Petty passed. So I think they definitely belong on there. It's just kind of interesting that they're included on there, but again, when you're kind of dealing with like a music snob list, Tom Petty always makes the cut, and I'm okay with that because Tom Petty's great. And number 6, okay, first metal band on here, and since this is the first one we've seen, we're definitely not seeing any of the actual like super heavy stuff on here like Slayer or Anthrax or anything like that. But number 6, Metallica. They kind of crossed over to that commercial area, kind of, they were on par with the hair metal bands, not musically, obviously, or visually or anything, but they were known by just as many people, even though I feel their commercial zenith was more so the 90s in all honesty, but obviously the 80s, they put out all the classic albums like Kill 'Em All, Master of Puppets, and of course, And Justice for All, which did break them through to a more commercial audience, but interesting that they're on there. Interesting they're on there because I thought that we weren't going to get anything even remotely heavy on here, but we got Metallica at number 6. What kind of world do we live in where a list like this that represents the 80s has Bon Jovi lower than Metallica? I'm not talking about the music or which one you prefer. I'm just saying when you're talking about the 80s, Bon Jovi ranks a little bit higher, I think, in the general populace, but whatever. So we're breaking into the top 5 here, and at number 5, we're starting things off with ZZ Top. All right, I like ZZ Top. You might have seen my video recently where I watched the documentary about them, and I've definitely been getting into them a little bit more, but interesting that they're so high. Obviously, they are a band that did hit their commercial peak during the 80s. Even with that being said, I'm surprised they're this high to a degree, but they definitely make sense on there. Obviously you got Eliminator and anything else, doesn't really matter. That's a huge record that definitely puts them on there. And number 4, Aerosmith. Aerosmith, wow. That's not a band I expected to be on there at all. I mean, obviously they were huge in the 80s, just like they were in the 70s and the 90s, and similar to Tom Petty, they've never really, not been a huge band outside of just a couple years there, but nonetheless, I kind of didn't expect to see them on here. Obviously, you had huge records from them like Permanent Vacation and Pump, but you also had some that weren't quite so huge from them during that time period, like Done With Mirrors, the criminally underrated record from them. But you also had their big comeback with Run DMC, which, do they even talk about that on here? I'm sure they do. There's no way that they don't talk about that on here. Actually, they don't. They're talking about Aerosmith in the 80s, and they don't bring up the Run DMC collaboration. What is wrong with you, ultimateclassicrock.com? I know it's technically kind of like a hip-hop thing, but come on, that's what brought them back to the commercial forefront and brought their whole career back, and you just ignore it. Wow, that's a weird omission for sure. I didn't expect you to throw Run DMC into the list of best classic rock bands of the 80s, but when you're talking about one that wouldn't have even had a comeback, at least to that degree, without one, you probably should talk about it. That's weird. That's just weird. I'm just calling it the way it is. So moving on. Number 3, REM. REM. I didn't expect to see them on there. Another band that I feel, commercially speaking, was bigger in the 90s. I'm kind of surprised they're on there, and I'm really surprised they're in the top 3. REM over, again, Bon Jovi or Journey or Motley Crue to represent the 80s. I think most people in the general populace, and that's who these lists are made for, would definitely disagree with that one. And that's not even a knock towards REM, I'm surprised by that one. I think more people would say Poison was one of the great 80s bands than they would REM, but nonetheless, we're at the point where we have 2 bands left, and we're not getting Poison. Even though that would be an amazing trolling at the end that number 1 was like Poison or Winger or Warrant or one of those kind of bands after what we've seen on this list so far. But let's trudge along. We haven't seen, what are some bands we haven't seen? We haven't seen Prince. If they have Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, they need Prince and the Revolution, obviously, and number 1, you know, that would make some sense. We haven't seen them. We haven't seen Queen. And they have been including bands that started in the 70s and had some big commercial success in the 80s, so we haven't seen Queen. We haven't seen Van Halen. We have not seen Van Halen. They're definitely one of those top 2. I bet they're one of those top 2. I haven't looked at this list, but I bet Van Halen's one of them. I could see Prince being number 1, but again, there's some odd omissions there, like Queen. I mean, I love Kiss, but putting in Kiss but not Queen, that's weird. Putting in Aerosmith but not Queen, that's weird. What else is there that's lacking? Because now I'm thinking about like pop musicians. There's not solo musicians, so you can't have Michael Jackson or something like that. GunsNRoses. Haven't had GunsNRoses yet. I bet 1 and 2. Let's predict it right now. We don't have Van Halen, we don't have GunsNRoses, we don't have Prince and the Revolution, we don't have Queen. I think those are the 4 most likely. I think there's a chance that Queen's not going to be on there, though. I'm knocking them out. Prince may or may not. I really think GunsNRoses is going to be one of them. And Van Halen would make sense and Prince would make sense. So let's see which ones we get. Number 2, Van Halen. That's right. Called it. Called it. Van Halen. There's not much else to say. Van Halen needs to be on a list of the greatest, 80s classic rock bands, because even though they started in the 70s and they definitely put out some great records then, they're an 80s band. When you think the 80s, when the general populace thinks of the 80s, they think of Van Halen. They think of partying with Diamond Dave and then somewhat partying with Sammy, but they definitely think of Hot for Teacher and Panama and all those great classics. So number 2, Van Halen, that makes sense. So what is number 1? What is the grand reveal for number 1? Are we getting Prince and the Revolution, or are we getting Guns N' Roses? Which one is going to get criminally ignored and which one's going to be praised by ultimateclassicrock.com? It's Axel and the boys. Guns N' Roses are number 1. Guns N' Roses are considered the number 1 classic rock band of the 1980s from America by ultimateclassicrock.com. And you know what? I can't argue too much with that, outside the fact that they kind of came out later in the 80s. That's the only thing that I think is a little bit weird, because representing the whole decade. They don't do it as well as some of these bands that were around for the party a little bit earlier, but yeah, Guns N' Roses, it makes sense. I mean, they're basically calling them the greatest band of that decade from one record. I know there's an EP there as well, but one record basically. But Appetite for Destruction is a masterpiece. I mean, that alone, obviously the singles, Welcome to the Jungle, Paradise City, Sweet Child of Mine, and then the deeper cuts that aren't even really that deep because the record sold so much, but it's so easy. Mr. Brownstone, Rocket Queen, My Michelle, it just goes on and on. That entire record is a masterpiece. Every song is great, and Guns N' Roses are a great band, so having them at number 1, I'm okay with that, even though they ignored, again, some of the bands we talked about, like Prince and the Revolution. If they're going to include Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, they could have put Prince in there. Queen, Poison, getting a little bit more on the hair stuff, No Cinderella, things like that. But, you know, when you see stuff on there like REM, you know, you're kind of lucky that Motley Crue was even included at that point. So there you have it, the list of the 20 greatest classic rock bands of the 80s according to ultimateclassicrock.com. I like saying that because it sounds like a radio station name, like you would hear it come across the radio station, like, you just heard Foghat on ultimateclassicrock.com. bomb. Don't you turn that dial. We have 1,000 more songs you've heard 1,000 times coming up. Get ready for some Pink Floyd. But all in all, that list was okay. There were some good, good choices on there. Some kind of surprising stuff. I mean, Devo was surprising. Blondie was a welcome surprise. The Go-Go's were kind of a weird one that I'm not sure really belonged, but they were there. REM was a mind-boggling one, especially so high on the list. If we'd started out at 20 with REM, that would have, made more sense in that way. Or, man, I just thought of the Stray Cats. Why are they not on there? I love the Stray Cats. They would have been a more logical choice, I think, than REM, because again, when you're listening to classic rock radio, you might hear some Stray Cats. You're not going to hear REM, but I don't know, I guess that was just one to throw in there to make people like me a little bit agitated. But with all that being said, what do you guys think of this list? Do you think they hit the mark pretty good? Do you think that this was a comprehensive list? Do you agree with it? What would you have added onto this list and what would you have taken away? Or would you kind of flipped it all around? Put your list in the comments below. Put your top 20 or top 10, top 5, top 50, whatever. Put a list of your favorite classic rock 80s bands from America. remember that's a thing on there, so you can't include Def Leppard or Iron Maiden or anything like that. Put that below and let me see that in the comments. I would love to know your thoughts and opinions on this list. I kind of gave you mine already, so we're not going to go too deeper into that, but let me know that in the comments below. And if you are new to this channel, hit that subscribe button because we're always releasing cool content like this. Hit the little alarm so you actually get the updates, and smash that thumbs up button because it really helps YouTube know that you exist and that I exist and that you love me and I love all of you guys. Again, my name is Kimchi Chris, and I will see you guys on the next video.